So good afternoon and welcome. My name is John Davis. I'm Chief Executive of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association UK, CPA UK, and I'm very glad to have with me this afternoon Chris Elmore MP. Chris, welcome.
Hi, John.
Thanks for making time for this. As you know, we're speaking to a range of members about how they're finding this new time to be an MP under the restrictions of COVID-19. You're a member of the Commons Procedure Committee. So you've been really at the heart of this. I wonder whether you can give us a sense of how it's been to be at the heart of constructing a way of Parliament working at this time.
I think the Procedure Committee, as a rule, people seem to think the procedure isn't very interesting. Well, I think we've actually burst that bubble over the last few weeks, that actually procedures of parliaments, of our UK Parliament, really matter in trying to find ways that MPs can have a say in what's going on, but importantly, scrutinising government as well, government ministers. So we've gone from looking at before COVID-19, looking at how we do proxy voting for parent leave and adoption leave. We were just in the middle of reviewing the success of that when obviously the need for a virtual parliament came about. So we've looked at everything from, how you can do spacing in the chamber, electronic and remote. The members could vote electronically, but from within the chamber. We're now looking at a double whammy of it being remote and electronic, and ensuring that we have the tech and the Wi-Fi and the ability to do that. And chamber, from a procedural point of view, for keeping MPs, as I say, having the option of scrutinising ministers, but also socially distanced and not risking any of the House staff that work on the parliamentary estate. And then the practical element of how we broadcast that so the public can see that and they can see the work that MPs are doing either virtually or in the chamber itself. And then managing the really important pieces of legislation that just in the last week we've been doing around domestic abuse and around fire safety, and indeed around the finance bill that obviously affects everybody because it's about taxation. So these are really crucial bits of legislation that obviously we needed as a committee to make sure procedurally, it's not for the committee to look at anything to do with legislation, but that procedurally could be done and could be scrutinised in a constructive way, and then moving to the next phase of how we're managing votes electronically if it's needed in the near future.
Chris, thanks. That's a really useful sort of snapshot of how it's been. If you look back on these, and it is only your first few weeks of it, what would you draw out as particular successes so far?
Funnily enough, some of the stuff that's happened in the chamber is quite interesting. So we now have speakers lists, so members know when they're going to be speaking. And I think that's a real positive and something that Speaker Hoyle was keen on when seeking re-election. And I think the consequence of a virtual parliament means that has had to happen. And I think that's really constructive. The other issue that maybe not everyone will understand, but in a non-virtual parliament, some MPs will wait for many hours to speak in a debate, will only get 3 minutes when they actually went into the chamber several hours before with a 7-minute speech, mentioning things about their constituency or particular policy areas that they may have worked on for many, many months in readiness to speak in a bill or a debate, and then they're told that the time is restricted. What's come out of this with a speakers list is also a 5-minute speech, which is much better for members to be able to prep and prepare. So I'm not saying those things won't change, when we go to a post-COVID world, hopefully, but it is a positive, and I've had lots of feedback from MPs that is sort of very constructive in the sense they're saying, well, yes, we now know roughly when we're coming in, or even as it happens, I've had to be in Parliament the last 2 weeks for my position as an opposition whip. But even for me in the chamber, I think I was 17th on one order paper for when I'll be called. So you're not sort of thinking, oh, am I going to get in or am I not going to get in? And for people making speeches, particularly on the domestic abuse bill, they were able to understand where they were in the order and also able to then think, right, well, that has been mentioned. I can add something else in, and I know I have 5 minutes in which to say what I want to say. And I think they're two real positives.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And you're not the first, even in these handful of conversations I've had in the last few days, to mention that, Chris. So that's interesting. So that's something which is going well and there clearly is interest in keeping. If you had to sort of be honest and point to one of the biggest challenges so far, the biggest thing that's missing, what would that be, do you think?
I think we will have to move eventually to some way of having more general debates and making sure that we have other issues. COVID-19 is hugely important. It's impacting many, many tens of thousands of people across the UK. But it's equally important that other issues aren't missed as well, or even a consequence of COVID-19, where things are having a knock-on effect, pressure on public services, for example. Those things at the moment, rightly, while the House gets used to a virtual parliament, aren't being looked at, but they will need to be in due course. And the same with constituency issues. Just before the changes and before COVID-19 was impacting the country in the way that it is, I was doing quite a lot of work on cavity wall insulation for constituents in Ogmore, where I represent, and they are important issues. People are losing their homes. There's things that MPs will raise on the floor of the House that are very local, that will be quite niche in some cases. Cavity wall insulation is a niche and impacts many people across the country. But it's something that lots of MPs will focus on. We don't have the option to do that at the moment. And I think it will come in due course, but it will take time and needs to be done in a very careful and sensible way, not to take government ministers' time away from the COVID-19 response. But it will need to happen at some point if this is a long-term effect of the virus on Parliament.
Thanks, Chris. And two other specific things that I suppose that you're experiencing, which if you were able to say a bit more on, you mentioned that you're a whip for your party. How's that changing and operating at the moment, if I can ask?
So obviously it's keeping people away, which I'm guessing if any MP watches this interview, they'll be fascinated by this, whether they're in my party or not. Whip's trying to encourage colleagues to do something virtually and not come to the House of Commons. Any MP or indeed any ex-MP who's ever been a whip in government or opposition would find that a very confusing instruction to give to their flocks, as we call them. And that is quite interesting, because you're saying to colleagues, no, you can scrutinise, you can ask questions, you can challenge, but please do it virtually. Don't come to London, don't come to Parliament. And in fact, this week, we had fewer colleagues on my side of the House, on the Labour benches, than we did the previous week, because it is about pushing those colleagues to stay in their constituencies, yes, do the scrutiny, but not be there. Now, interestingly, when we come to voting, if we do it electronically and remotely, there will still obviously be whipping to be done in that. I don't know how that's going to work. If I'm honest, it'll be interesting to see how that works, to make sure that MPs, and I'm sure for the government as well, because obviously the government will need to win votes, that they will need to have whipping arrangements. That normally you're in a division lobby, you have whips on either side of the lobby, so you know where you're going. When you go down the correct lobby in the main, that's always the ambition with whipping, is that you follow the whip. So how that will work electronically and remotely, just to add to the complexity of whipping, I don't know. And the other issue within that, interestingly, just yesterday we took some evidence on this in Procedure Committee, is how we monitor the vote to know the result. Because that's something else that will need to be looked at. Because for those who don't know, we literally count members coming out of the lobby. and then the two whips on that lobby will report it to the Speaker of the House, something that people will see on television across the world, particularly for the UK Parliament, and the system is used, obviously, as you know, John, for other parliaments across the globe. But obviously, how do we do that in a virtual parliament? Because often whips won't be there; they'll be in their constituencies, and there'll only be a small number of whips from government and opposition there. And what then happens to those colleagues who are actually in Parliament? Would they go through the lobby and have the division there while the electronic division is taking place? So there's a whole host of issues around the virtual vote. But then equally, there is some complexities about how we would vote in the non-virtual sense for those MPs that are there. For example, ministers are obviously in London responding to the COVID-19 virus. Senior members of the official opposition are obviously in London, doing their work in scrutinising and working with government where they can constructively. So how does that work? So that's a bit of a challenge as well for modern whipping, shall we say, modern day whipping.
Yeah, and as you say, I'm sure that will be of interest, like much of this, to other CPA branches of parliaments across the Commonwealth and more generally. And conversely, I know that our parliament is looking at the experience of other parliaments, large and small, near and far, in this. So that's part of the reason we at CPA are doing what we're doing on this. If I may, just one last area. You mentioned your constituency at Ogmore, which is in Wales, for those who don't know. And obviously, some issues, as in some of our other Commonwealth countries, are devolved from central government to the government and the Assembly in Wales. Any particular sort of insights you've had on how that is working or not working in this interesting time?
So the Assembly certainly has been undertaking scrutiny of ministers. Speaking as a Welsh resident, I can view the Senedd debates quite openly on Senedd TV, and I can see Assembly members scrutinising. In fact, I beg your pardon, they're called members of the Senedd as of today, the 1st of May, so they're now called members of the Senedd MSs, and they're scrutinising ministers. They've actually looked at legislation and had a vote on some of the COVID-19 legislation that came from the UK Parliament on behalf of the devolved institutions across the British Isles, or across the UK. And they are now looking at committee work. Some committees have been meeting and scrutinising, and as I understand it now, the Assembly will be doing that as well, and looking at how they can do their committee work. And I think it's interesting how the devolved institutions and the UK Parliament and vice versa can learn from each other about how we adapt to the virtual Parliament or Assembly or whatever it may be, to make sure that ministers at every level of government will be scrutinised. And I think that's a perfectly healthy thing to do, to learn from each other. And equally, I hope, as and when COVID-19 ends in terms of the social distancing and the lockdown conditions that we're living under, that we actually pick up some of the pluses from this, and make sure they're implemented in what would be considered normal times for parliamentary scrutiny.
Chris, that's a very, I think, positive and forward-looking place to conclude for now. Thanks for your time, and thanks for sharing those thoughts and those insights. And perhaps we can be back in touch in a couple of weeks' time when some of these other processes are being rolled forward, such as the voting, which you mentioned. So, but anyway, for now, thanks very much for that.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much indeed. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.